inside a Victorian traveling circus. It used to be called entertainment. In reality, it was a place where people broke. One wrong step, one slippery rope, and a body fell from a height from which it was impossible to climb back up. In Victorian traveling circuses, there were no safety nets, no doctors, and almost no rules. People fell under the dome. Horses trampled performers. Lions broke from their cages. Spines broke, quietly, without applause. And if someone died, the show just went on. Today we're going to go inside the circus, not as spectators, but as those who were supposed to survive. Could you go through that and stay alive? This is not a horror story. This is history. Under the dome, where it is not accepted to scream. When you enter a circus dome, the first thing you smell is a smell. It is not the smell of a holiday, not cotton candy or sawdust. It is the smell of dampness, sweat, animals, and old fabric, which has absorbed fear for decades. Overhead is a canvas, thick, heavy, darkened by time. It is held on ropes that never seemed reliable, and if you look at them for too long, you get the feeling that they are tired of holding on to life. A Victorian traveling circus is not a building. It is a temporary place, a camp that appears at night and disappears as if it never existed. Today, on the outskirts of the city. Tomorrow, on a wasteland near the factories. The day after tomorrow, in another county. Here they don't ask for names. Here they don't keep stories. Here, bodies work. Under the dome, it's dark even during the day. The gas lamps shine yellow and unevenly, as if they themselves aren't sure whether they want to see what's happening. The spectators sit in a circle. Their faces disappear into the shadows. You hear them, but you can barely see them. Whispers, coughs, expectations. And in the center is the arena. Round, closed, a place from which there is no escape. Everything here is built so that you look up, because the danger is not on the ground. The danger is above you. You raise your head. There are ropes, trapezes, wooden rungs polished with your palms. No net, never. In the Victorian circus, a net is a luxury, and luxury is time and money. There is neither here. There is only one rule that is not spoken aloud. If you fall for real. The acrobats come out in silence. No smiles, no bows. Their faces are calm, but it is not confidence. It is a habit of taking risks. Most of them are former workers, children of the factories, of the ports, of the streets. The circus does not look for talent. It looks for desperation. Here they pay more than in a factory, and they pay immediately. But no one pays when the spine breaks from hitting the ground. The first movements are slow. Hands touch the rope. Fingers squeeze the fibers that were once strong. Slippery under the palms, not from the rain, from old grease and sweat. A horse snorts somewhere to the side. Something big is moving in the cage. The animals are nervous. They always sense danger before people. The drum sets the rhythm. Slow, deaf, like a countdown. And then, the first jump. The body breaks away from the platform. For a moment, silence. The same silence when everyone holds their breath. Falls here are not accompanied by screams. Nobody screams. Because screaming means losing balance, and balance is life. The circus does not stop if something goes wrong. This is another unspoken rule. If an artist breaks, the drum may not fall silent. If someone lies still, the performance continues. The body will be dragged away later. Or they won't be dragged away. The audience doesn't always understand that they've just seen death. Sometimes they applaud. They think it's part of the act. Sometimes they're silent. And that's the worst part. Because silence means that everyone understands. In a traveling circus, death is not an event. It's a production risk. It's not written down in the playbill. It doesn't make it into the newspapers. There are no investigations, no compensation, no questions. The circus just moves on. And those who survive go out under the dome the next evening because they have nowhere else to go. You're sitting in the audience. The lights are dimming. The drum starts beating again. And somewhere deep inside, a strange thought arises. What if today, not everyone returns down when the body falls first? In the circus, they never say the word fall. They say torn off, as if it's something temporary, as if the person simply slipped out of the moment and didn't lose control of their own body. But those who have actually seen it know the difference. A fall is a sound, not a scream, not a blow, but a short, dull thud that is unlike anything else. At first, the body flies almost beautifully. A second, 2, 3. The clothes flutter. The hands instinctively reach for the air, and then contact. The ground of the circus arena is harder than it seems. Under a thin layer of sawdust, compacted soil, sometimes boards, sometimes stones. The back takes the blow first, then the neck, then everything else. There are no doctors here. There is someone who has seen a fracture before, and someone who has held a bandage before. If a person moves, that is a good sign. If he does not move, he is not touched immediately. Because worse than death, to survive and never get up again. In a Victorian circus, a broken spine is a sentence. No operations, no rehabilitation, no second chance. There is only a bed in a van and silence. Some artists were still breathing after falling. They talked, even laughed from shock. And after a few hours, the body stopped obeying. The feet are cold, the hands are heavy, and the feeling as if you have been cut off from yourself. Such people did not stay in the circus. They were left somewhere along the way, in inns, in shelters, or simply left, without names, without a story. Newspapers sometimes wrote about an accident, but without details, without those responsible, because a circus is not a factory. It is not subject to rules. Those who survived the fall returned under the dome earlier than they were ready, not because they wanted to, because otherwise they would be hungry. Pain became the background. Trembling was the norm. Fear was a constant companion. They learned to move as if their bodies were not theirs. And each new jump was not a demonstration of skill, but a test of fate. But it was not only acrobats who fell. Horse tricks were no less deadly. A horse, frightened by the light or the noise, could throw a person off and trample him. The animal does not stop. It does not understand what happened. The human body breaks down quickly under hooves. Sometimes death was instantaneous, sometimes slowly. And the spectators again did not always understand that they had witnessed a tragedy. They applauded, because the circus taught them to look, but not to see. The scariest thing is that after the first death, a second one no longer seems impossible. It becomes expected. And somewhere deep in the dome, an understanding is born. If you are here long enough, the question is not whether you will fall. The question is when. When the cage is no longer a limit. Animals in the circus were never part of a fairy tale. This appeared later, in posters, in memories, in attempts to make the past softer. In reality, everything was simpler and tougher. The cages stood along the edge of the dome. They were low. The iron was thin. The locks were old. Lions, tigers, bears came to the circus not born for performances. They were caught, transported, kept in the dark. The road was long. The wagons shook. There was a shortage of food. Water was even less. An animal that has not slept or eaten properly for weeks does not learn. It suffers. And patience has a limit. The trainer did not enter the cage as a hero. He entered as a man who knew that taking a step back meant losing his job. In his hands was a whip. Not for a blow, for a sound. Sound meant control. As long as the animal could hear it, it obeyed. But sometimes the sound was lost in the noise, in the drums, in the screams, in the music. And then another speech began. A lion does not attack immediately. It looks. The look of an animal in the circus is not aggression. It is an assessment. Are you weaker, or are you slower? Or are you no longer confident? Many trainers have died not because of an attack, but because of a delay. A second of hesitation, a wrong step, turning your back. The cage did not protect. It closed. When the lion charged, everything happened without a scream. Quickly, precisely, for real. The audience at first thought it was part of a show. The movements were too coordinated. Only when a person fell and never got up again, something changed in the air. Sometimes the lions were dragged away. Sometimes they were shot. Sometimes they simply closed the curtain. The body was taken out later. The newspapers wrote, "An accident with the animal." No one wrote about the conditions, about the cages, about hunger. But there were even worse moments. When the cage opened at the wrong time, the bolts jammed, the hands slipped, the mechanisms broke, and the animal went out in the wrong place. Sometimes into the arena, sometimes backstage, sometimes to the audience. Panic in the circus is a chain reaction. The horse breaks down, people scream, the lights go out, and the animal is just looking for a way out. There are documented cases when a lion walked between the rows without attacking, because people's fear sounds louder to it than aggression. But if someone fell, the circus did not stop touring after such cases. It changed cities, and the new audience did not know what happened yesterday. The trainers who survived the attack returned to the cage with scars, not out of courage, out of necessity, because the circus is not about second chances. It is about how many times you can look death in the eyes and pretend that it is just work. And under the dome, where children laugh, the most dangerous creature is not an animal, but a man who decided that he could control something that was never designed to be controlled. Fire that cannot forgive. The fire in the circus looked beautiful. That's why they loved it. The flames under the dome seemed controlled, small, almost tame, as if they could be made to obey. But fire is not a trick. It doesn't know a script. Fakirs, fire dances, burning hoops, all this appeared not as art, but as a cheap way to shock. Fire sells well, even when it kills. Fuel was stored wherever it was needed, in unmarked bottles, in boxes under the benches, next to the dome fabric, which caught fire instantly. Kerosene, alcohol, oil, sometimes mixtures about which no one knew exactly what exactly they did to the body. The fakir had no protection. Hands are bare, face is open. One sip of liquid, one breath, and if something goes wrong, the flame goes inside. Burns to the lungs are not immediately visible. A person can still walk, talk, even bow to the audience, and after a few hours, breathing becomes painful. After a few days, it becomes impossible. But there were other cases, when the spark did not touch the mouth, but the clothes. A Victorian costume is fabric, lots of fabric, layers, cords, decorations. It does not burn quickly, it smolders, and a person does not immediately understand that it is burning. While he feels warmth, there is still time. When he feels pain, time is gone. The audience often thought that this was part of the performance, because who screams so convincingly? And screams under the dome sound different, death, as if someone is wrapping them in cloth. There were fires, not big ones, not the ones that destroy the city, but the ones that start with little things, a lamp that fell, a candle that was not extinguished, a flame that touched a rope. The dome burned slowly, but when it caught fire, there was almost no way out. People ran to the entrances. Animals jumped out of their seats. Cages tilted. Smoke descended. And the one who stood closer to the ground survived longer. There are documented cases when, after a fire, bodies were found that did not have burns. They simply did not have time to breathe. The circus often disappeared after a fire. It did not recover. It did not apologize. It simply ceased to exist. And the people who survived moved on, to another dome, to another city, to another fire. Because fear is not always stronger than hunger. And each new performance began with the hope that this time the flame would remain beautiful. Little bodies that fall quieter. Children in the circus were no exception. They were the system. Little bodies are lighter, more flexible, cheaper. They are easier to lift under the dome, easier to throw in the air, and, most importantly for the owners, easier to replace. Most circus children did not come voluntarily. They were born in vans, or they came here from shelters, or they were given away for food, for debts, for a chance to survive. The circus called it training. In reality, it was risk-taking. The child was put on the rope before she learned to read. Her hands did not yet know strength, but they already knew the fear of heights. Children's falls were different. Not so loud, not so hard. Sometimes the body simply disappeared from sight, and someone quickly covered the audience's eyes. If a child broke an arm, it was considered good luck. If a leg, it could be left for simpler acts. And if a back, they stopped talking about it. The child could not leave. She did not know the way. She did not know the city. She did not have a name that meant anything outside the circus. The training was tough. Not because anyone hated children, but because there was no time. The act had to be ready. The poster was already up. The tickets were sold. Fear was not considered a reason. Crying was weakness. Refusal was disobedience. Sometimes the child was so afraid that the body stopped obeying. Such children fell more often than others. But there were others, those who got used to it. Fear became the norm. Height became a habit. Pain became the background. They were the ones who survived longer. And they were the ones who paid for it later. Because a body that grows in danger grows differently. The back bends. Joints wear out. Lungs remember smoke. And memory does not forget falls. Adult artists often looked at children in silence. They knew that they could not change anything, because once they were these children themselves. And when the next number ended, and the little figure bowed to applause, something was wrong. Because the applause sounded louder than those falls, which not everyone heard. The circus loved children not for their innocence, and for the fact that they held on longer before breaking. Those who survived, but no longer belong. After an injury, a person in the circus ceased to be an artist, but they did not yet become anyone else. This was an intermediate state, the most dangerous. As long as you can stand, you are still useful. As long as you can move, you will find a job. Those who survived after falls often returned under the dome with a body which was no longer reliable. The knee would not bend, the shoulder would come out of joint. The spine ached so much that it was impossible to lie down at night. But the circus did not know the word recovery. Here they only knew the word today. If you cannot perform a number, you become a shadow. They take you backstage. They give you ropes, cages, lanterns, menial work that the audience doesn't see. Former acrobats dragged cages with animals. Former riders looked after horses, which could kill them with one blow. It wasn't a punishment. It was a sign to leave. Because the circus doesn't kick you out right away. It waits for you to disappear. Some left, when the pain became stronger than the fear of hunger. But most stayed, because outside the dome, they were faced with even worse. Without education, without a craft, without a healthy body. The cities didn't wait for circus cripples. The shelters were overcrowded. Factories wouldn't take in those who couldn't stand all day. And then a person would agree to anything. Become a watchman. Guard the wagons at night. Sleep next to the animals. Those were quiet nights, and it was at night that memories came. Falls, screams, silence after the blow. Some started drinking. Others became silent. Some talked to themselves. The circus did not interfere. As long as the person did not interfere, it existed. But when the injury made movements slow, when the hands trembled too much, when someone started falling without a number, it became a problem. And the problems were solved simply. The person was released in a city where the circus stopped for a short time, without recommendations, without money, sometimes without documents. Thus, former artists became those whom you see in old photographs near train stations, with broken bodies, with empty looks, and with hands that once held on to the rope. The circus didn't remember them, but their bodies remembered the circus. and every new artist who came out under the dome looked at them out of the corner of his eye and knew, this is not a success story. This is a trajectory. The only question is at what point you'll get off it. Quiet people with money. Under the dome, everyone took risks, but not everyone made decisions. The real owners of the circus almost never entered the arena. They were not seen in the light of the lamps. They stood to the side, in the shadows, near the box office. The Victorian traveling circus was a business, tough, mobile, without a permanent address, and without permanent responsibility. Every act had a price. Every injury, an acceptable risk. Every death, losses built into the calculation. The audience did not pay for safety. They paid for the feeling that they were seeing something that should not have happened. The more dangerous the act, the fuller the seats. Fear sells better than miracles. The owners knew it, and they never said it out loud. They talked about expenses, about routes, about the weather, about how much more you can ride before someone breaks down completely. Safety nets were expensive. New equipment was even more expensive. A doctor on staff was a luxury. And an artist who risked his body was cheaper than all of that combined. If someone died, the owner didn't count on life. He counted on whether it would affect tomorrow's performance. And usually it didn't. Because the city was changing. The audience was changing too. The new people didn't know what had happened yesterday. The posters were silent. The advertisements spoke only of courage, exoticism, unprecedented tricks. Death was not included in the text, but it was between the lines. There were circuses that deliberately raised the level of danger when sales were falling. Higher tricks, more fire, fewer interruptions. Because when people stopped being afraid, they stopped paying. Sometimes the artists knew that the act had become more dangerous. Sometimes they didn't. The ropes were rarely changed. They were checked even less often. Breakages were attributed to failure, and failure is not the fault. It's convenient. The scariest thing is the circus owners didn't consider themselves cruel. They considered themselves practical. The world was cruel. The strongest survived. The circus only showed it on stage. And if someone fell, it means they weren't careful enough, or skilled enough, or just unlucky. This is how the mindset worked, in which life is an expendable material. Under the dome, the artists risked their bodies. Under the dome, the owners risked only their reputations. And if it was necessary to choose between safety and profit, the choice was made even before the show began. Therefore, the circus did not change. It simply moved on. And those who remained learned to live with the idea that danger is not a mistake of the system. That is the system. Silence after the dome. After a death in the circus, there was no mourning. There were no bells. There was no stopping. There was silence. Not the silence of respect, but the silence in which nothing was asked. If someone died under the dome, it was not talked about the next evening. It was not written about on posters. It was not warned about to the new audience. The body disappeared in the same way as the circus itself disappeared, quickly and without a trace. Sometimes a person was buried in the local cemetery, without relatives, without a name on a stone. Sometimes they were taken further to be buried where no one knew their story. There were cases when the death was not even recorded. If the artist was temporary, if he had no documents, if no one was looking for him. The circus lived at the junction of cities and laws. It was always between counties, between jurisdictions, between responsibility and oblivion. Local authorities rarely interfered. The circus was a guest, and a guest not for long. In addition, it brought money to merchants, to inns, to landowners. The death of an artist did not stop the flow of spectators, but a scandal could. Therefore, silence was more profitable than the truth. Those who saw the tragedy rarely talked about it later. First, people do not like to remember that they applauded when someone died. Second, many people were simply not sure that they had seen death. The circus blurred the lines between the act and reality, between the game and the body. And this confusion worked for the system. Sometimes the newspapers did write, briefly, without names, without details. Incident during the performance, tragic accident, unfortunate mistake. Words that explain nothing and blame no one. Days passed. The circus moved on. The city returned to its business. But those who remained in the circus remembered. They remembered exactly where the person fell. What was the sound? Who looked away first? Silence became part of the training. Not to ask, not to linger, not to remember. Because the one who talks too much may be the next to be kept quiet about. And over time the artists got used to it. Not to death, to its absence from conversations. This is how survival works in a system where truth is not needed. Silence kept the circus alive, and the circus lived on. And today, when we try to reconstruct these stories, we often find only blank spaces, gaps, hints, shadows, and old photographs. Because the past does not always disappear with time. Sometimes, it is deliberately kept silent. Rules of those who wanted to live until morning. There were no safety instructions in the circus. There were no posters. There were no training sessions. But there were rules. They weren't written down. They were passed down in whispers, from the oldest to the youngest, from those who survived to those who didn't yet know what real risk was. The first rule was simple. Never trust the equipment. The rope betrays. The crossbar breaks. The lock gets stuck. If something looked reliable, it only meant one thing. It hadn't been tested for a long time. The second rule. Look at the animals, not the people. People can lie. Music can cover up fear. The poster hides the truth. And an animal never hides tension. If the horse is nervous, something is wrong. If the lion doesn't look you in the eye, something is changing. The third rule. Never be the first and never be the last. The first one checks the act on himself. The last one gets the tired equipment. The safest place is in the middle. There were others, less obvious. Don't perform if your hands are shaking. Don't go under the dome if you haven't slept. Don't try to impress. It kills faster than mistakes. But the most important rule was that was never said out loud. Go if you feel it's time. Some artists left alone, quietly, without saying goodbye. They disappeared into the city, leaving the circus without explanation. Sometimes they were seen later, on the docks, in factories, at train stations. They limped, but they were alive. Others stayed too long, because fear changes. First it protects, then it dulls, and then it disappears altogether. And when fear disappears, a person begins to make mistakes. They jump higher. They linger longer. They make unnecessary movements. That's how the experienced died. Not the beginners, not the children, but those who knew how everything worked here. Surviving in the circus was not about strength, and not about talent. It was about the limit, knowing when to stop, and having the courage to leave when everyone is waiting for you to do another act. Those who lived to old age almost never became legends. They were not written about, they were not remembered, but they remained alive. And perhaps that was the only real victory in a circus that never promised safety. When danger became too visible. At the end of the Victorian era, the circus began to change, not because it became more humane, but because death was no longer invisible. Cities grew, newspapers were printed more, it became harder to silence people. What used to get lost between counties now left a mark. Individual tragedies went beyond the dome. They were talked about. They were argued about. Sometimes they were outraged, especially when children died, or when an animal broke out of the circus and became a threat to the city. Scandals did not stop circuses immediately, but they did what the owners feared most. They scared the audience, not with the fear they paid for, and the fear is real, the one that makes you not buy a ticket. Some cities began to require permits, inspections, papers, nothing systematic, nothing reliable, but it was a beginning. The first safety nets appeared, not everywhere, not always, rather as an experiment, as a compromise. The owners calculated, will the number of spectators decrease if the danger becomes less obvious? Sometimes it decreases, sometimes it doesn't. But the main thing changed. The artists began to survive more often. Not because the risk disappeared, but because it became a little more controlled. There were conversations about responsibility, about limits, that life is not just an expense. These conversations were not liked in circuses. They were seen as a threat to the business. And many traveling troupes simply did not accept the new rules. They moved on, to places where questions had not yet been asked. But the world was changing faster than the wheels of wagons. What had once been perceived as part of the spectacle now began to look like cruelty. And some artists felt it. They began to demand, or to leave. And the circus, which had once seemed like a place with no way out, slowly lost its absolute power. Not immediately, not for everyone, but cracks appeared, and through them began to seep a question that no one had asked aloud before. Does entertainment have the right to cost lives? The shadow of the circus that has not gone yet. The circus we are talking about seems to be a thing of the past. The canvas domes are gone. The gas lamps are out. Lions are no longer led between the pews. But the danger has not disappeared with them. It has simply changed form. Today we call it extreme sports, reality shows, talent shows, dangerous stunts for the camera. We say, he knew what he was getting into. It was his choice. They pay well for it. That's what they said back then. The only difference is that today the risk is wrapped in rules, contracts, and beautiful words. But the mechanics have remained the same. The viewer wants to feel the limit, that very second when the body may not be able to withstand it. And if the limit is not felt, the spectacle seems boring. Modern artists rarely die in front of the audience, but the injuries have not gone anywhere. Broken spines, torn ligaments, destroyed bodies, which can no longer live as before. And just like in the Victorian circus, after the injury, a person becomes invisible. Their story ends. The show goes on. We do not see those who did not return to the stage, who did not recover, who disappeared. This is the shadow of the circus. It is long, and it stretches through the centuries. The only difference is that now we have memory. We can look back and see how this model was formed. We can understand that survival was never part of the show. It was always a side effect. And when we look at old photographs of circus performers, at their straight backs and calm faces, it is worth remembering. This is not confidence. It is the experience of living next to danger. The circus has taught people one thing. Danger can look attractive, but it always comes at a price. The only question is who will pay, the one who watches or the one who goes under the dome. Would you survive? Imagine the dome had already been dismantled. The canvas had been removed. The vans had moved on. The place where the circus had just been was once again an empty field, as usual. There were no monuments left here, no plaques, no names, just trampled earth and a few pieces of wood, which nobody cared about. This is what most places look like, where people survived or didn't. The Victorian circus didn't leave behind a big story. It left behind thousands of small ones. Stories of falls that didn't make it into the newspapers, about bodies that didn't return home, about people who disappeared between cities. Not the strongest survived, and not the bravest. Those who survived who could read the threat before it became obvious. Those who knew when to stop, when not to go, when to leave, even if it meant starvation. And the majority? The majority simply stayed because they saw no other way out. The circus was not a trap with a lock. It was a trap with no alternatives. And that's what made it so dangerous. It's easy to say today, I wouldn't go. I would give up. I wouldn't risk it. But imagine yourself without money, without a home, without a craft, with a body that already knows pain, and before you is a choice. Go under the dome or don't eat. It's not a choice between risk and safety. It's a choice between danger and slow extinction. This is what survival looked like in the past. Not heroic, not pretty, but practical. And when we look at the Victorian circus today, it's important to remember, this is not a story about the cruelty of individuals. This is a story about a system in which life had a price but lacked protection. And if the question were asked honestly, without romance, without the distance of time, would you survive? Not as a spectator, but as someone who is holding onto the rope, hearing the drum, and knowing that there is solid ground below. This is not a horror story. This is a story about the limits that people crossed to live another day. This is not a horror story. This is history.